This is a set of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for the New Year 1920. It is volume 195 in the Collected Works. Lecture 1, given in Stuttgart, December 21st, 1919. Those of you who attended the last lectures held here will now understand that it is a demand of our time to let the so-called science of initiation, the true science of the spiritual life, flow into today's cultural development. I have also described what hindrances stand in the way of spiritual science, flowing into both the cultural life of the present and that of the future. Above all else, in the world today, there is what I have often characterized as the fear of spiritual knowledge. One only has to say this, and people nowadays pretend to be offended. For how, according to some people, at a time when we have come so wonderfully far, could people have any kind of fear of knowledge? Indeed, people today believe they are able to encompass nearly everything with their intellectual powers. But people are not generally conscious of this fear that I have often described. In their consciousness, people pretend that they are brave enough to receive every kind of knowledge. But deep in the unknown part of the soul, which today people basically don't want to acknowledge, there sits this unconscious fear. Because these people have this unconscious fear, there rise up in them all kinds of reasons that they claim to be logical objections against spiritual science. However, they are only emanations of the unconscious fear of the science of the spirit that reigns in human souls. For in the depths of the soul, every human being really knows much more than is known intellectually. We do not want this knowledge, rooted in the depths of the soul life, to rise to consciousness because we are just afraid of it. Above all else, the human being divines this about the supersensible worlds. In everything we call thinking, in everything in the world of thoughts, something of the supersensible world can be found. Even materialistically minded people of today cannot always rid themselves of the suspicion that something is indeed contained in the life of thought that points somehow to a supersensible world. But at the same time, people also suspect something else about this world of thought, that this thought life is related to actual reality, in the same way an image seen in a mirror is related to the reality being reflected. And just as the image in the mirror is actually nothing real, so the human being should also admit that the thought world is not a reality. In the moment that the human being had the courage, the fearlessness, to admit that the thought world is not real, the person would also be seized by a longing to know the spiritual world. For we surely would like to know what is actually real behind what we only see as a reflected image. But now I must point out that what I have just said has an important polar opposite. If by means of spiritual science we cross the threshold into the supersensible, then everything we experience here as sensible reality is transformed to a mere picture, an apparent image. Just as here on the earth the supersensible world is a mirror image, so is the earthly world only present as a mirror image in the supersensible world. If we speak out of the science of initiation, we must therefore, of course, speak of sensible reality only as pictures. When we speak this way, people feel that the world, where they can stand so comfortably, breathe in so comfortably, see so comfortably without having to do anything about it, except at most to open their eyes in the morning and to rub them a bit, is just turned into a picture. When people feel this, they begin to feel unsafe. They begin to feel about as unsafe as someone who has come to the edge of an abyss and is seized by dizziness and fear. On the one hand, a person would have to feel that thinking here in the sense world is merely a collection of images, and on the other would have to feel, but gets over it because of the unconscious fear, that what tells of a supersensible world makes this world into an image. Now, of course, not everyone today can easily experience what someone who enters directly into the world of initiation has to go through. Those entering the world of initiation must not only recognize what all people today should strive to recognize, but they must also live in it. They must live in it the way one lives with one's body in the physical sense world. That means they must actually, so to speak, as a substitute, experience what one goes through in the physical sense world at the moment of death. They must become able to live in a world for which the physical sensory human being is not suited at all. Even when we only cut our finger a little, we feel a certain pain and uncomfortable feeling. Why do we feel something uncomfortable when we cut our finger? Well, for the simple reason that the knife certainly cuts into the skin, muscle, and nerve, but not into the supersensible etheric body. When the finger has not been cut, then our etheric body matches the uncut finger. When we have cut the finger, but cannot cut the etheric body, then the etheric body no longer matches the cut finger, and therefore the astral body feels pain. The pain comes from the mismatch with the physical corporeality. When the human being steps across the threshold of the supersensible world, then the physical body is no longer attached to all the other bodies. Then the person gradually feels in a larger way something like what is felt after a finger is cut. And this, my dear friends, this we must imagine the person feeling to an unlimited degree. Now, of course, one can hardly imagine what would come over people of the present day, who are often so brave in their consciousness, often so woeful in their souls, if they were suddenly to be able to live in the supersensible world, and if they had to endure all that comes from being unfitted for this supersensible world. Present-day humanity has come so far that they can comprehend everything related by those who know about the life in the supersensible, and this is an absolute necessity for the healthy human understanding of the present day. For only the knowledge of the supersensible can enlighten us about everything surrounding us today in such a chaotic and devastating way. Indeed, we live in a world where we must say about the things that appear and occur, they cannot continue to be. They must undergo a transformation. But present-day humanity cannot at all see through what actually lives around them, because one can only see in this way through the knowledge of initiation. One can only do it by being able, above all else, to compare the life of the present with all the influences that in the course of centuries, of millennia, have deeply affected the development of humanity. At a certain point in time, it had to be said publicly, the one fruitful impulse we need to bring into human life, which is beset by such destructive phenomena today, is none other than the three-folding of the social realm. By saying this, human souls were directed to the three basic streams of social life of the present time: the true cultural life, the political rights life, and the outer economic life. A great number of life's phenomena are encompassed within each one of these basic streams. Let us then allow these streams to briefly pass before our mind's eye, one after the other. Today we have a spiritual life in which the human being participates in various ways. One individual may only attend a public school based on his or her economic or legal life circumstances, while another may advance further in our institutions of learning. What people absorb in those places lives with us as part of our social life. This is what determines our relationship to our fellow human beings. Now is the time when one must in a profound way bring up the question, where then does this whole spiritual life come from, and how in the course of its development has it assumed the exact character it has today? If one traces back to the true origin of our spiritual life, then one must first pass through certain stations, so to speak. What prevails today in the life of our public schools, in the life of higher education, all harkens back to the distant past. I will omit the in-between stations. Usually one does not know where the public school system originated. For example, one does not realize that it goes back to what arose in ancient Greece. Basically, our spiritual life is nourished by impulses that lived in ancient Greece in a somewhat different form, which have only transformed themselves since then. But they also arose in the East, and then had, several millennia ago to be sure, a different form than they already had in ancient Greece. In those days, in the East, the impulses were mystery wisdom. If we leave out our political rights life, which is chaotically tangled up like a ball with the spiritual life, and leave out the economic life, if we separate out our spiritual life in an abstract way, then we can trace the way back thousands of years to certain mysteries of the East. In these mysteries, there was something altogether alive, while the educational institutions of today have a lifeless character and teach only dry, prosaic abstractions. If we transport ourselves back in the spirit to those mysteries of the East, then we meet human beings presiding over these mysteries, whom we can describe as a kind of combination of priest and king, and at the same time, strange as it may sound to people today, of economist and manager. For in these mysteries, I want to call them mysteries of the light or of the spirit, an all-encompassing knowledge of life was practiced, a knowledge of life that was aimed both at investigating the being of the human being out of the world of the heavens and the stars, and at regulating the lawful community life of people in the light of the above gained knowledge. From these mystery centers, directions were given out to care for cattle, how to plant the fields, how to build canals, and so forth. This initiation knowledge of ancient times had a powerful social impact. It filled the whole human being, and was something that did not simply say nice things about what was good and true, but was in a position to control, organize, and shape practical life out of the Spirit. The path these leaders of the mysteries followed, and that as far as they could they showed to the people connected to these mysteries, was a way from above downward. First, these leaders of the mysteries strove to reveal the spiritual worlds, and then they worked downward in that they concretely took hold of the Spirit according to the basic principles of the atavistic art of clairvoyance. They worked down into the political life, to the political structuring of the social organisms, all the way to economics and commerce. That was wisdom with life impact. How did this wisdom actually come about in humanity? If we go back to the times when these mysteries were not yet authoritative, in the regions of civilized humanity there were many people with a certain primitive atavistic clairvoyance, people who, when they spoke of what they needed for their life, could depend on the impressions of their heart, their soul, their seeing. These people were spread out over the regions of today's India, Persia, Armenia, North Africa, Southern Europe, and so on. But one thing did not live in the souls of these people, what today we regard as our proudest soul capacity: intelligence or understanding. Understanding was not yet needed, so to speak, by the population of the then civilized world, for what is done through intelligence today was then done out of the people's soul inspirations, and was led and guided by their leaders. But into just those regions there spread out what we could call another race, what we could call an entirely different kind of human being than the population of which we are speaking. In the sagas, myths, and in history as well, it is said that in very ancient times people came down from the highlands of Asia who brought a certain culture to the south and southwest. Spiritual science must determine what kind of people these were, who came down to those people who received the directing force of their lives only out of their inspirations, from within. We find through spiritual science that these people, who came into the civilization of that time like a new element of the population, combined two things that the others did not have. The other people had atavistic clairvoyance without understanding, without intelligence. Those who came down also still had some clairvoyance, but at the same time they had the initial basis for intelligence and understanding. These are the first Aryans, as described by history, the first caste distinctions, at that time external, physical, empirical in nature, first arose from the antithetical relation between the old atavistically inclined souls and those whose soul forces were penetrated by understanding, distinctions that still have their after effects in Asia, and about which Tagore speaks, for example. The most eminent of these incoming people, who had at the same time the old clairvoyance and the understanding and intelligence just then arising in humanity, became the leaders of those mysteries of the Eastern Light, and from them proceeded what later developed in Greece. So that, sketching it out schematically, I can say to you, and then Steiner has a drawing here, it's a bit complicated to describe. From the East, the Spirit streamed forth. It was a living wisdom with a practical life impulse. In the course of time it came over to Greece, and we still perceive its after effects in the earliest Greek culture. But in the progress of Greek culture it becomes, so to speak, filtered, thinned out, as the bearers of the culture lose the old clairvoyance, and the intellect takes its place ever more and more. As a result, the culture bearers thereby lose their significance, because they are significant only because they are simultaneously endowed with both clairvoyance and intelligence. But in history it happens that something that was significant in ancient times lives on into a later time, and so in the cultural life of Greece the people continue to live equipped, so to speak, with what was significant for that former time, when the leaders of the mysteries were like envoys of the gods. And so what formerly was a wisdom with impulsive strength was transformed into Greek logic and dialectic, into the Greek wisdom that has already been filtered down when compared with what was once its Eastern source. At the time of that wisdom's Eastern origin, one knew exactly why there were people who paid attention when the leaders gave their directions in the field of economics, but in Greece it had become a division into masters and slaves. The division between people still existed, but its deeper significance was gradually lost. The Greeks still had something of much greater significance that they at least knew came from the old mysteries, but that was filtered down even more on its way into our cultural life of recent times. For there, in our recent cultural life, it has become completely abstract. Today we deal in abstract knowledge, and do not find a connection any more between this abstract knowledge and outer life. This cultural current came through Greece and proceeded into our colleges, high schools, and elementary schools, and into the whole popular spiritual life of modern humanity. And today we can observe a peculiar phenomenon. Among the people who wander around us today, we meet those whom we call the nobility or aristocrats. We endeavor in vain to find a reason why one is an aristocrat and the other is not, because the ability to recognize the difference between an aristocrat and a non-aristocrat has long been lost by humanity. The aristocrats were the leaders of the Eastern mysteries of the light, and they could be this because from them emanated everything that had a real life impulse in the political and economic life. This wisdom has been filtered. The structure it had brought about among people had become an abstraction, without any sense for those standing within it, and from this abstraction arose what we call feudalism. In the outer social life, this feudalism is tolerated, because also irritating those others for whom it makes no sense. Perhaps also irritating those... Let me read that sentence again. In the outer social life, this feudalism is tolerated, perhaps also irritating those others for whom it makes no sense. One does not think any more about its sense, because it is not found in the life of today, but in the chaos of the present time. The feudal origin of our abstract knowledge and learning is still quite apparent. When our contemporary spiritual life then became entirely a life of journalism, an expression was invented, truly a word monstrosity, that was intended to bring about a transformation of our life. But that has only become a description of our completely rachitic spiritual life. Quote, spiritual aristocracy, unquote. Rachitic is R-A-C-H-I-T-I-C. Spiritual aristocracy? If someone wanted to explain what is actually meant by that, then one could only say, it is what used to have strong impact in all areas of practical life in the Eastern mysteries, which made sense then, but is now totally squeezed out and has no sense whatever today. If one wanted to make a picture of our spiritual life now, then one would have to draw a tangled-up ball of wool down there, where the three threads are so tangled up together. It is our essential task to disentangle this ball, and for that we turn our soul's attention to the second cultural stream. This second stream has a different origin, which also lies far back in the evolution of humanity, but which originates in the actual being of the mysteries, namely in the mysteries of Egypt. Having called the Eastern mysteries the mysteries of the light, I would like to call these the mysteries of the human being. These mysteries attempted, above all else, to gain the wisdom from their Egyptian origin that gives the capacity to bring structure into human community life, to formulate a basis for the relationship of people to one another. But this mystery stream then spread out and up through southern Europe, just as the other one did through Greece, and found its way through to the Romans, a people lacking in fantasy. I would like to call it the stream of the law. Everything that in the course of human development has gradually been cultivated as jurisprudence, as determination of rights, that is the filtered knowledge, the filtered perception of these mysteries of the human being. The second thread within our cultural ball has reached all the way to us, but very, very changed, very metamorphosed, having passed through Rome and its absence of fantasy. We cannot understand contemporary life if we do not see that so far human beings have remained unfruitful for the life of the Spirit and the life of rights. If we do not see that humanity received the spiritual life after it had made the long journey to us from the Eastern mysteries through Greece, and the rights life after it made the long journey to us from the mysteries of Egypt by way of Rome. One could point to many phenomena that would be proof of contemporary humanity's unfruitfulness, but we need only look at the path taken by Christianity. When it was time for Christianity to appear upon the earth, where did Christ Jesus have to appear, so that what he had to give to the world would find a way? He had to appear in the East. He had to place what he had to give to humanity into what lived in the East. The mystery of Golgotha is a fact. What people know about it is still developing. What was said about the mystery of Golgotha was clothed initially in everything that still remained from the mysteries of the East. The mystery of Golgotha was surrounded by the knowledge and wisdom of the Eastern mysteries, and people attempted to understand it with this wisdom. That is about how we still find Christianity at the time of the Greek church teachers. One can also point to still another phenomenon. When the completely spiritual, barren Western culture sought for spiritual refreshment in the person of one of its representatives, what did it do? Some people from England and America got together and took the wisdom from the defeated and enslaved folk of India. That is, they recently went over to the East to search for what had remained as a last remnant of that spiritual stream. Hence, it was Theosophy, with an Anglo-American coloring, which wanted to draw from this source, but in its current condition. It is the barren state of contemporary spiritual life that stands out most strongly just in the Western countries. And the second stream is the one that has a political legal character, which went through Rome, and is the origin of our life of political rights. This stream only flowed into our legal system through a side branch, and continues to work in it, so that in many ways what flowed into our culture in the form of spiritual life was received in a roundabout way from the Roman political juridical system. Even Christianity, which spread itself out in the West under Roman influence, took on the form that was determined by it. What then has become of the religious element as a result of passing through the transition point of Rome? It has become the great jurisprudence called the Roman Catholic religion. There, God, with his lesser gods, is altogether a being who rules according to Roman legal concepts, only in the supersensible world. The concepts of sin and guilt are stuck in there, which are actually judicial concepts that were not contained in the mysteries of the East or in the Greek view of life. These are judicial concepts of the Romans. It is a religious stream totally tied up in legalisms. Everything that is expressed in life can also take on a beautiful form, and so when we see this judicial political scene with the world god become a world judge, and the whole of world development finalized by a judicial act, beautifully glorified by the paintings of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, it is the glorious expression of a Christianity tied up in legalisms, a legalistically tied up Christianity that finds its crowning moment in the last judgment. We must unravel the tangled up ball of our spiritual life and political and rights life in order to see what is contained in it, because being in it we live in a cultural chaos. These streams have their influence on us, and we must disentangle them. But yet a third stream has flowed into our cultural tangle, which took its origin more from the north, and which up to now has been primarily preserved, also filtered, but in another direction, in the Anglo-American social organization. I would like to call this the mysteries of the North, or the mysteries of the earth. What developed first of all as primitive spirituality from the mysteries of the East, from the mysteries of the earth, is a different way than that taken by the spiritual element in the East. Let me read that again. What developed first of all as primitive spirituality from the mysteries of the earth is a different way than that taken by the spiritual element in the East. There it took the way from above to below, first revealing itself as the mysteries of the heavens and the light, then carried down into the political and economic sphere. Here in the North, things developed out of the economy. This origin has, to be sure, disappeared from outer life. At best it can still be noticed in some old remnants that have still survived. Take, for example, such customs that are still described when speaking of the old northern culture, of which England is a part. There, at a certain time of year, you find processions going through the villages with a crowned bull, whose task it will be to fructify the cows. In this, a longing for the spiritual life was brought out from below to above. There, everything, even what was there of primitive spirituality, was based on the economic life, and all festivals originally expressed something of the purpose of the economic life. Just as in the Eastern culture the way was made from above to below, so must the way here in the North be made from below to above. Humanity must be raised up from below, from the economy, up through the life of rights, into the mysteries of the Spirit. But you see, this way from below to above has still not progressed very far. If we examine the way the judicial life has developed in the Western countries, we find it is entirely oriented according to Rome. If we examine the spiritual life, we often find it, not as obviously, characterized by its Eastern origin, as in the Indian theosophy I spoke of earlier. However, we do find what is contained there as original spiritual life, which was not imported from the East or legalistically from Rome, trying hard to separate itself out of the economic life. Let us take a characteristic case. We can only understand such philosophers, such investigators of nature as Newton, Darwin, Mill, Spencer, and Hume, when we see how they developed above and beyond the economic life, how they tried to find the way upward. For example, we can only understand Mill as a national economist if we explain him as being beyond the economic fundamentals that surrounded him. We can only understand the English philosophers if we explain them as being above these economic fundamentals as well. This is something attached to the third stream, the stream of the mysteries of the earth, which streams from below upward and which, still quite inexplicably, has woven itself into our modern civilized life as the third thread in our ball. There you have the three threads that live in our so-called civilized life, chaotically woven together in a ball. In a certain way, people have always risen up against this, least of all in the West. There and in America, the economic life that came from the mysteries of the North was embraced, and on this were built theories that were foreign to and devoid of the Spirit, though built scientifically. The juristic political rights life was taken up via the roundabout way through Rome, and the spiritual life element from the East. In Middle Europe, resistance rose up against this from many quarters. There, in many ways, people strove to apprehend these things in their purity, most intensively in the spiritual life that I would like to call Goetheanism. Goethe, who wanted to eliminate jurisprudence from natural science, is characteristic of the uprising against the merely Eastern spiritual life. Because just as in Christianity, we also have jurisprudence in natural science. We speak of laws of nature. Those from the East did not speak of laws of nature, but of the rule of the cosmic will. Laws of nature only arose when the Roman side stream was taken up. There the judicial law crept in through a window into the perception of nature and became law of nature. Goethe wanted to grasp hold of the pure appearance, the pure fact, the pure phenomenon, the archetypal phenomenon. Unless we cleanse our natural science from the appendages of jurisprudence, we will not achieve a cleansed spiritual life. Therefore spiritual science, everywhere, takes hold of facts, and only points out laws as secondary phenomena. Then we also find a certain opposition to the Roman legal system, which is also found sticking in the heads of those oriented toward socialism. For instance, yes, even a Prussian minister of education in Wilhelm von Humboldt, when he wrote his beautiful essay on the limits of the state's activity, there lived in him something of the urge to thrust the cultural and economic life away from that of the state. Read the lovely little reclam booklet. I don't know what it costs today. It used to be available for a few pennies, titled Ideas Toward an Attempt to Determine the Limits of the Activity of the State. There lives the urge to extract the legal political activities out of the other two. This uprising against the old lives in German philosophy as well. Excuse me, let me read that again. This uprising against the old lives in German philosophy as well. But health and healing can come into this cultural development of humanity only if we develop a healthy view of what the knowledge of initiation can give us concerning the origin of our cultural life. Particularly in Eastern Europe, perception takes place through the feelings, and there one always perceived the necessity of the three elements living together in our present cultural life. For of these three streams, what came from the north, came to expression most characteristically in the West. There the economic life drowns out everything else. We can see the legal aspects particularly in Central Europe, and we find a great deal of the mysteries of the East, of the light, in Eastern Europe and in Asia. There, where we still come across the caste system, we still find something of the idea of the old feudalism coming from the spirit. Life, penetrated by law, has bred the modern bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie comes from the legal stream. Today one must clearly see through these things. I would like to say, subconsciously, people have the urge to see through such things, but only spiritual science can bring real clarity to this urge, this longing. It always also showed itself in the 19th century, how people strove to arrive at ideals for the future through the intermingling of often unclear currents. One wanted to achieve this by not having people face one another abstractly. They do so today because the life of the Spirit and the life of rights has been filtered and lives in us in an abstract way. And the economic life pants along behind to find the way from below upward. In Eastern Europe, where so many significant and devastating things are taking place, there this longing first showed itself when people tried to deal with this cultural entanglement by rising up against it. The Russian revolutionaries of the second and last third of the 19th century tried to fructify what had been left behind in the East and still contained a certain preliminary stage of the cultural life. They tried to fructify it with what appeared in Middle Europe as an uprising against what was handed down from olden times. And so in the letters exchanged by Russian revolutionaries of the second and last third of the 19th century, we see how they actually point out that already in Middle Europe, the intellect, the pure, merely abstract life of reason, had tried to penetrate itself with a certain spirituality. And ever and again amongst these Russian revolutionaries, something arises that can be expressed thus. In German philosophy, it was attempted to uplift the intellect, which had lost the old clairvoyance, to a certain spirituality once again. In the East, one wanted to become intimately familiar with what had arisen in Middle Europe, and the intimacy was reflected in the way these revolutionaries wrote. They very much revered the philosopher Ivan Petrovich, and spoke about how he had raised himself to purity of thought, how he had tried to bring the spirit once again into the dialectical thought games of the Western culture. And they tried to draw conclusions from this philosophy. In order to express more fully their feeling relationship to him, they call him not Hegel, the Ivan Petrovich. Let me read that again. In order to express more fully their feeling relationship to him, they call him not Hegel, quote, the Ivan Petrovich, unquote. Just in these efforts we see a preliminary ghostly vision, I would like to say, of what was later destined to become devastating. In our time there must be clarity over the whole earth. Therefore everything must be done to help this clarity achieve victory. But if the effort is made to come to this clarity, we must become aware of all we are up against today, the need of people to feel comfortable besides many other things. We must get out of the habit of considering people's need to feel comfortable, because humankind needs the Spirit, and the victory of the Spirit will not be achieved in the comfortable ways that are often taken today. For today the acceptance of the knowledge of initiation is fought with strange weapons. It was recently a great satisfaction to me when our dear friend Dr. Stein wrote to Dornach of how he had unhesitatingly put in his place an enemy of the human spiritual life here in the neighborhood. It was on an occasion that is quite significant indeed from a cultural historical aspect. For there it happened, and you will correct me if I am mistaken since I was not there myself, when one of our friends cited some saying from the Bible. The minister who was chairing the meeting did not like the truth of those sayings and maintained that here Christ was mistaken. Was that said? Agreement from the audience. When today someone does not know how to help themselves in these matters, then that person becomes infallible, but Christ is mistaken. We have come a long way. You see, all these things testify to the character of the truth of what is living as spiritual life through humanity today. The spiritual life can no longer remain in the sphere of truth when it has become entirely abstract. But one must perceive what is really happening here. The periodical titled The Threefold Social Organism recently gave an account of a meeting that was reported to have taken place here in Stuttgart, at which both Roman Catholics and Protestants took issue with what is disseminated here as spiritual knowledge. The Dom Capitular was supposed to have said that a discussion was unnecessary because people could inform themselves about Rudolf Steiner's teachings from the opposing publications. But the writings of Dr. Steiner were not to be read because the Pope had forbidden it. In fact, this is the latest instruction from the Jesuits of the Congregation of the Holy See that applies primarily to Catholics, that Catholics are forbidden to read writings about anthroposophy. Therefore, today, Roman Catholics are required to inform themselves about what I teach from the writings of the opponents, from the writings of Seiling and some others, because my writings are forbidden by the Holy See. Against this, if one knows the whole attitude of the Roman Catholic Church, and knows how the individual, integrated the way he or she is only a representative of the whole organization, one must raise in all seriousness the question in one's deepest soul: how can such a proceeding be in any way at all reconciled with human morality? Is it not deeply unethical? Today we must not hesitate to ask such questions. We now live in a very serious time, and cannot afford to continue sleeping on in an easy, comfortable, and lazy way. We must without reservation really bring those things that can bring about healing to expression, while at the same time throwing the necessary light on the immorality of the untruthfulness of the present time. And when we come right down to it, this untruthfulness has been spread to no small extent. Recently, Dr. Boos brought me an essay by a doctor of sociology. It began approximately with the following words: "What a way it is from the clear thoughts of Waxweiler to the obscure thoughts of Rudolf Steiner." But the author continues, "This gentleman was also the intimate of Wilhelm II, and it is said that just in the last years he stood by Wilhelm II with important counsels, so that one can call him the Rasputin of Wilhelm II. Quote, 'We do not want to be the one to spread this rumor,' unquote, it says in the following sentence. There you can learn two things. First, the moral degradation of such a person, who makes himself the bearer of this rumor, and his wonderful logic when he says that in spreading this rumor before his readers, he is not the spreader of this rumor. Many people think like this today, abandoned by all the spirits of reality. What they say is already far beyond any reality. For I cannot say, I say something in that I don't say it. For Monsieur Ferrier, who wrote this, creates that kind of a model of the human being. One cannot have anything to do with such morally depraved individuals. I could only determine, and I hope it will be thrown in his face, that I had the following connections with Wilhelm II. First, I once sat in a theater in Berlin, perhaps in the year 1897, upstairs in the first row, and in the middle of the theater Wilhelm II sat in the royal box, and I saw him at a distance of about from here to the end of this hall. The second time I saw him was when he walked behind the coffin of the Grand Duchess of Weimar, quite a long way off. The third time was in the Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, when he rode through the streets with his retinue, his marshal's staff in his hand, and the people were shouting hurrah. These were all my connections to Wilhelm II. I have not had or sought any others. In this way today, assertions are made, and some of what you read, fixed on the paper with black printer's ink, is not worth any more than this dirty rumor, which is used today to make a heresy of anthroposophy in the Catholic countries. Today one must go to the source of things. Today it is not enough just to accept the things that are said, but it is necessary that people accustom themselves to going to the source of what is said and asserted. But the capacity to recognize the true origin of the outer factual world will only come to bloom for humanity out of a deepening into real spiritual knowledge. The end of Lecture 1. This is a reading of a set of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for New Year 1920. It is volume 195 in the Collected Works. Lecture 2, given in Stuttgart, December 25th, 1919. When in the last few years I spoke at a seasonal festival, Christmas, Easter, or Whitsun, I had to point out that, especially on such occasions, we have no right at the present time to celebrate such festivals in the usual way. We cannot forget, so to speak, all the pain and suffering of today, and on such days only remember the greatest things that have played a part in the human development. Especially because of our spiritual point of view of the world, we have the duty to allow all the manifestations of the decline taking hold of humanity in today's culture. We must allow all this to stream in, even right up to the Christmas tree. Today we truly have the duty to take up the birth of Christ Jesus into our hearts and souls in a way that does not ignore the frightful decline that has taken hold of the so-called cultured people. For particularly on this day it is up to us to bring up the question, has even the thought of Christmas been subjected to the universal forces of decline? Do we still feel when we speak about Christmas today what human beings should feel when they direct their thoughts and feelings to this festival of Christ? Does humanity in general have a feeling for the real purpose of the part played by the whole mystery of Golgotha in human development? Today we light up our Christmas trees we speak in old customary phrases and words about the things connected with the Christmas festival. But all too often we avoid fully awakening our consciousness to the necessity of saying, "A decline is at hand. Where are you, power of Christ, to really help us so that we can bring about a new uprising?" For that much should have become clear to you from our discussions over recent decades concerning the spiritual view of the world, that only with the help of the power of Christ will it be possible to imbue decadent culture with the impulse that will enable it to rise up once again. In these days, one must often think of people who, in the middle and last third of the 19th century, despite a certain materialistic frame of mind, certainly spoke with more honesty than the majority do today. Today I want to remind you of a rather materialistically minded personality, the Swabian David Friedrich Strauss. As you know, titled The Old and the New Faith by David Friedrich Strauss, is in a certain way a Bible of materialism. Among the questions he poses in this book is, can we still be Christians? David Friedrich Strauss gives an answer which has the peculiar characteristic of being born out of an ur-materialistic mindset, but is honest at the same time. Strauss develops the idea of a world structure that is only built up out of material physical laws, where the human being also contains nothing besides physical laws. And from this conviction he answers the question of whether we can still be Christians with an honest no. The people who represent this natural scientific view of the world, as David Friedrich Strauss does, out of the consciousness of this age, cannot be Christians. Thus, out of the no of David Friedrich Strauss, there speaks a fatal but altogether honest state of mind, and today one sometimes has the feeling that if only the so-called official representatives of this or the other religious creed could be as honest as David Friedrich Strauss, if only they could realize that even though they use the name of Christ, fundamentally they are working against Christianity. Nowadays we may not conveniently close our eyes to the most essential and important developments of the time. Some may not think it to be in the spirit of Christmas. I do think it is. If I mention an experience I had in connection with a spiritual investigation of something immediate and actual at this present time. You know those people, particularly in Central Europe, who are largely to blame, as much as people may be blamed for such things, for the dreadful circumstances we experience today, World War I. What did they do after Europe was struck by disaster? They write books. And so we have books about the greatest variety of people. We have a Tirpitz book, we have a Ludendorff book, and I could still name several others, but I restrict myself to these two. You see, with the help of spiritual knowledge, one can do the following experiment. We can, entirely within the sense of a spiritual scientific outlook, put the question to ourselves, what form of thinking is expressed in the books of Tirpitz, Ludendorff, and their like? I have tried to examine this question from all sides in a conscientious way, and have asked myself, what kind of thought forms do these men have, on whom depends so much of the destiny of Europe? But if we do not proceed in an abstract way, but penetrate concretely into such things, then we must make comparisons, and so I ask myself, when, perhaps, were such thought forms cultivated in the normal course of European development, such as Tirpitz and Ludendorff are now doing? And, after a conscientious examination of the facts, it turns out that at about the time of the Roman Caesar, people thought in this way. Basically, there is no difference between the way Julius Caesar thought and lived in his soul, let us say in his Gallic wars, and the way Tirpitz and Ludendorff now formulate their thoughts. But that means that these people have a thought life that is completely untouched by Christendom, for Julius Caesar lived before the mystery of Golgotha took place. And all that these people say, when from time to time the name of Christ Jesus crosses their lips, is nothing but a vain lie, because their soul life has developed in such a way that they have nothing to do with actual Christendom. From many considerations, we of course know that when something develops at the right time, then fundamentally it is good for humanity. It is something else if it remains stuck and then appears later on. When that is the case, such as when what was appropriate at Caesar's time still plays a role in the 20th century, then it becomes something Luciferic. For if something remains active that really belonged to another time, it becomes Luciferic. That indeed is the essence of what is Luciferic. And now we ask once more, how can it come about that those personalities that destiny has raised up to take on positions of leadership have remained behind in this way? If we want to answer this question, we must observe those who pretend to penetrate their spiritual life with the Christ impulse, but who actually work in an anti-Christian sense. We must direct our attention to many official representatives of religious denominations who supposedly quote from the Gospels, but who oppose everything that really wants to be said about the living Christ in our time. The most anti-Christian people are today frequently found among the priests, the preachers of the so-called Christian denominations. Whoever investigates this kind of thing among all the publications, such as the book by Adolf Harnack, titled Das Wesen des Christentums, The Nature of Christianity, considered by many to establish the tone in these matters, will receive the answer to such a question. If in this book one crosses out the name of Christ and replaces it with the name of some general, unknown God who rules and weaves through nature just as he does in the life of the human being, if one crosses out the name of Christ and puts in its place the Old Testament name of Yahweh, then the book becomes more true than it now is, because only then does it make sense. The fact is evident that Harnack knows nothing of the real being of Christ, that he venerates a general, indeterminate God, and then attaches the name of Christ to it. And who is this Adolf Harnack? He is the theologian who set the tone for the spiritual direction out of which sprang up the likes of Tirpitz and Ludendorff. Because no real revelation of Christ came any more from the representatives of the denominations, there is no perception of the real Christ revelation by the people who are connected with current events. When they speak of the Christmas festival, it has no meaning whatever for the thousands and millions of people of today, for they do not know the being of Christ Jesus in the way one needs to know him in our present time. We must look at such things if we want to become clear, in a deeper sense, about the reasons for the downward trend in what is happening today and in human life under these circumstances. I have often spoken to you here about that important event that took place in the last third of the 19th century, through which a special relationship was established between what we call the archangelic power of Michael and the destiny of humankind. I have drawn your attention to the fact that since November of 1879, Michael must be the regent, so to speak, for all those who want to bring to humanity the right powers for its healthy progress. In our time, when we say something like this, we point out two things: an objective fact, and how that objective fact is related to all that human beings want to engage in their will and in their consciousness. The objective fact is simply that in November 1879, beyond the sphere of the physical world, in the supersensible, the following took place. Michael won the power for himself, that when human beings come toward him with all their lives, in their souls, he can so penetrate them with his strength that they can transform the old materialistic power of comprehension, which until then had become so great in humanity, into a spiritual power of comprehension. That is the objective fact. It has taken place. We can say of it, Michael has entered into a different relationship with humanity since November 1879 than he had previously. But it is necessary that we serve Michael. What I mean by that will be best clarified if I explain the following. You know that before the mystery of Golgotha took place on the earth, the Hebrews of the Old Testament looked up to their Yahweh or Jehovah. Those of the Hebrew priests who perceived Yahweh with full consciousness knew that they could not approach Yahweh directly with human knowledge. Even the name was considered unpronounceable, and when it had to be spoken of, only a sign was made that is similar to certain sign relationships we search for in eurythmy. But it was clear to these priests that the human being could approach Yahweh through Michael. They called Michael the countenance of Yahweh. Just as we come to know human beings when we look into their visage, when we reach a conclusion from the mildness of their visage about the mildness of their soul, and about their character from the way they look at us, in the same way the Old Testament priests wanted to reach conclusions about Yahweh, whom it was not possible for humanity to reach, based on what crept into their soul as atavistic clairvoyant visions of the visages of Yahweh and Michael in their dreams. These priests had the correct attitude toward Michael and Yahweh. They had the right attitude to Michael because they knew that when the human beings of that time turned to Michael, they would find the strength of Yahweh through Michael, which was fitting for the human being of that time to seek. Since then, other rulers of the soul of humanity have stood in the place of Michael. But since November of 1879, Michael has appeared once again and can be made active in the life of the human soul if one seeks the way to him. And today these ways are the ways of spiritual scientific knowledge. One could equally well say the Michael ways as the ways of spiritual scientific knowledge. But just since that time when Michael entered into a relationship with human souls in this way, to once again become their direct inspirer through 3 centuries, the demonic counter-forces have also set to work most powerfully, having previously prepared themselves. So a call went out through the world that now passes through the hearts and minds of the people, which during our so-called war years, actually years of terror, has become a great misapprehension in the world. What then would have become of the Hebrew people of the Old Testament if they wanted to approach Yahweh directly, instead of coming close to him through Michael? They would have become intolerant and egotistical as a people only able to think of themselves. For Yahweh is the God connected to everything natural, and who expresses his being in the connection between the generations of the people and in their character as a people. Only because at that time the old Hebrew people wanted to approach Yahweh through Michael did they save themselves from becoming so egotistical that not even Christ Jesus could have come forth out of their midst. Because they penetrated themselves with the strength of Michael, as that strength then was, the Hebrew people thereby did not impregnate themselves with forces producing such a strong folk egoism as would have resulted from a direct approach to Yahweh. Now today Michael is the world regent once again, but humanity is required to relate to him in a new way, because now Michael is not the countenance of Yahweh, but the countenance of Christ Jesus. Now we should approach Christ through Michael, but for the most part humanity has not yet struggled through to that realization. Humanity has atavistically preserved the old qualities of perception through which one approached Michael when he was still the mediator for Yahweh. And so today humanity still has a wrong relationship to Michael, which shows itself in a characteristic way. Again and again during the war years, one heard the great falsehood, independence for each and even the very smallest nation. This sentiment is a false one, because in this time of Michael it is human individuals, not groups of people, that are important. This falsehood is nothing but an effort to penetrate every single group of people with the pre-Christian Michael strength of the Old Testament. As paradoxical as it may sound, there exists today among so-called civilized humanity the tendency to transform luciferically what was justified in the Hebrews of the Old Testament into the innermost impulse of every group of people. Today, with a pre-Christian state of mind, one wants to create Polish nations, American nations, French nations, and so forth. We strive to follow Michael in the way that was appropriate before the mystery of Golgotha, when through him one should find Yahweh, a God of the people. Today, through him we should find Christ Jesus, the divine leader of all humankind. We must find feelings and ideas that have nothing to do with any human differences on the earth. But these we cannot seek on the surface. We must seek them where the human soul and spirit is pulsating by way of spiritual science. We must decide to seek the real Christ by way of spiritual science, in other words, in a Michaelic way. The Christ who can only be sought and found on the basis of a spiritual striving for the truth. Otherwise, we should rather put out all the Christmas lights, kill all the Christmas trees, and at least honestly admit to ourselves that we do not want to have any recollection of what Christ Jesus brought into the development of humankind. And so there resounds to us, out of the memoirs of people of today, a pre-Christian, which in our time means anti-Christian, state of mind. When people we consider as representative make themselves heard, such as Wilson, then in those 14 points he gave resounds an entirely Old Testament state of mind, which in our time becomes a Luciferic state of mind. Where does this come from? What is going on here? If we go back in time to the development of humanity, before the mystery of Golgotha, in ancient times when Eastern culture was developing, we find on the earth a human personality within the culture that later became the Chinese culture of today. This personality was the human incarnation of Lucifer, who at that time really walked upon the earth, and who was the bearer of the human light that was the basis of pre-Christian wisdom, except that of the Hebrew people. What emanated from the Lucifer incarnation thousands of years before the mystery of Golgotha still streamed through what lived in the Greek civilization, in the arts, in their view of the world, and in statesmanship. We must in particular be clear about the fact that everything we today call human understanding is still a gift of that Lucifer, so long as we have not spiritualized it. Only we must not develop the pedantic, bourgeois, sectarian attitude. Luciferic, that is something dreadful, that must be stripped away. If one wants to strip it away, one takes it in all the more, because over thousands of years of human development, it has become necessary to accept the heritage of the incarnated Lucifer. Then came the mystery of Golgotha. But then a time will come when, just as Lucifer once incarnated in the East as an earthly personality, in order to prepare the coming of Christianity, the real Ahriman will likewise appear in the West in an earthly incarnation. We are approaching that time when Ahriman will actually wander over the earth. As truly as Lucifer and Christ actually wandered about as human beings, so Ahriman will wander over the earth with an intellectual faculty of tremendous power. We human beings do not have the task to prevent the incarnation of Ahriman, but we do have the task of preparing humanity in such a way that a right assessment of Ahriman will be made. For Ahriman will have tasks, and will have to do one thing and another, but human beings will have to assess and utilize, in the right way, what comes into the world through Ahriman. Humanity will only be able to do this if we can today orient ourselves in the right way to what Ahriman is already sending to the earth from other worlds in order to be able to operate on the earth without being noticed. Ahriman must not operate on the earth without being noticed. We must fully recognize his peculiar nature and be able to face up to him in full consciousness. Now while I am lecturing here in Stuttgart, I will show you some of the things that must be carefully watched in the development of humanity until the incarnation of Ahriman, so that when he comes he will be properly evaluated. Today I would only like to draw your attention to one thing in relation to Ahriman. Just as bad as the worst materialistic view of the world are some of the current interpretations of the Gospels. When today the Gospels are simply taken as they are by the representatives of the so-called religious communities, and when every new revelation is rejected, then such a devotion to the Gospels, such a way to practice Christianity, signifies the best way to prepare oneself in an Ahrimanic sense for the earthly appearance of Ahriman. A great number of representatives of the so-called confessions of today are paving the way for Ahriman, in that they disregard the truth. Quote, "I am with you always, even until the end of the world," unquote. In that they declare all that comes forth out of a direct perception of the contemporary Christ to be heretical, in that they conveniently hold on to the Gospels in a literal way, but literal only according to them. There should be a wisdom to protect people from holding on to the Gospels in this way, since in a purely external way the four Gospels contradict one another when approached only through our intelligence. Whoever today does not advance to a spiritual interpretation of the Gospels spreads a mendacious interpretation of them, because he deludes people about the external contradictions that exist in the Gospels, and to delude people about their most important concerns is just what best advances the aims of Ahriman. It is very necessary for people of the present time to place Christ in between Ahriman and Lucifer. The strength of Christ must penetrate us, but as human beings we must always seek the balance between what would, so to speak, draw us up in an extravagant, mystical way, and what wants to drag us down to the earth in a materialistic, intellectual, and heavy, pedantic way. At every moment we must seek the balance between what would uplift us luciferically and what would make us want to strive downward in an Ahrimanic way. In the search for this balance lies the Christ. And only when we strive to find this balance can we find the Christ. Due to an unusual circumstance, something very remarkable happened in humanity's more recent development, in the time when materialism was entering in. I will only refer to two documents, Milton's title Paradise Lost and Klopstock's title Messiah. There the spiritual worlds are described as if a paradise had been lost and the human being had been thrown out of it. Both Milton's Paradise Lost and Klopstock's Messiah deal with a duality in the world, with the contrast of good and evil, the divine and the diabolical. But you see, that is the great error of recent times, that one pictures the culture of the world as a duality, while it must be pictured as a trinity. There are the upward-striving luciferic forces living in the human blood that both approach the human being in what is mystical, extravagant, and full of fantasy, and degenerate into the fantastical. Then there are the Ahrimanic forces that live in everything that is dried up and heavy, physiologically speaking, in the bony system, and in the middle, between the two, stands the Christian element. The first is luciferic, the second Ahrimanic, and in the middle between the two is what is Christian. What has happened in recent times? Something that humanity should observe with truly spiritual intellectual fervor, because if we do not understand this, we will not find our way to Christmas in the right way. How do we read Milton and Klopstock and their descriptions of the supersensible world today? We read them in such a way that luciferic characteristics are carried over into everything we want to call divine. Such men as Milton and Klopstock want to describe the battle between the luciferic, which to them appears as the divine, and the Ahrimanic. And a great part of what present-day humanity describes as divine is merely luciferic. But we do not rightly recognize it, just as little as we do the Ahrimanic. This still plays into Goethe's Faust, when we find the quote-unquote Lord confronted by Mephistopheles. For even Goethe could still not separate the Ahrimanic from the luciferic. Thus his Mephistopheles became an intermingling of Lucifer and Ahriman. I have already referred to this in my booklet titled Goethe's Spiritual Nature. Today one is a Goetheanist in the true sense, not if, as some academics and others of the present day do, one simply quotes Goethe verbatim, but when one also sees what had to change in Goethe, particularly when one follows his view of the world beyond the year 1832. But the way must be found to quietly admit to ourselves that much of the luciferic element was contained in what was called the divine during the materialistic centuries, and that we can take much of what people used to spread as religion as merely words that enter humanity on luciferic wings. Only then, when people will again recognize the duality of the luciferic, which wants to lead them upwards, and the Ahrimanic that wants to lead them below themselves, and come to recognize what is truly Christian, will people once again stand before the Christmas event in its true meaning. Through the true meaning of Christmas, we can remember how what actually gives real meaning to the earth entered into the development of humanity. Today one should sometimes think of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo once painted his great picture, The Last Supper, with Christ surrounded by his apostles. He painted a long time on this picture, 20 years. He wanted to paint a great deal into this picture. He could not finish because he tried again and again to paint the figure of Judas in the right way. Now, according to the city government of Milan, the abbot of the monastery for which the picture was being painted was his immediate superior. When a new abbot was named, he was not as easygoing as the old one, but critical, giving Leonardo a hard time and demanding of him that the picture should now be finally completed. Leonardo replied that now he could indeed finish it, for the new abbot had provided him with a model for Judas. Then he shortly painted the face of Judas that we see in the picture. Just as the way the face of Judas appeared to Leonardo at the beginning of a new time in our history, so today we already have ample reason to really inscribe into our hearts and souls how he whose birth we are commemorating at this holy festival of Christmas is betrayed most of all by many of those who declare that they prepare his feasts based on their convictions. We know that this Christmas festival also belongs to what later arose out of the development of Christianity. It was only in the 3rd and 4th centuries that people began to celebrate the birth of Christ in these December days. Some centuries had already elapsed since the event of Golgotha, when the perception of that event allowed something new to arise, even as radically new as the institution of the Christmas festival at that time. And much, much later, it was still possible to plant new things into Christianity. Also, then, one had to fight against many of those who called themselves true Christians. But today there are many people at work who don't want to be found wrong, as their own convictions were found to be wrong when the Christmas festival was instituted in the 3rd and 4th centuries, who rigidly cling only to what they say is written, rejecting every life-containing revelation. Today it is quite dreadful what those who are half asleep, who with their immoral attitude often besmirch what wants to enter into the spiritual life. But most dreadful are those who out of conviction betray even the actual spirit of Christian development. That is the serious mood into which the lights of the Christmas tree want to transport us today. I wanted to point out these things today, but it is out of a different context that I will speak to you the next time. The end of Lecture 2. This is a reading of a set of lectures by Rudolf Steiner, entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for New Year 1920. It is volume 195 in the Collected Works. This is Lecture 3, given in Stuttgart, December 28, 1919. From the discussions we have had here for some time, especially from those of recent days, it should be apparent how very necessary it is that the knowledge of initiation should enter into human cultural development. Today we must already say entirely without reservation, the rescue of humanity from a downward course of development depends literally on making humanity aware of the revelation that can only be experienced through spiritual cognition. Emotional or logical objections may be made from one side or another. It may be said that in our time it will be difficult for large numbers of people to accept knowledge that for now can only come from the few individuals who have developed the capacity of looking into the spiritual world to a high degree. But even seemingly justifiable objections say absolutely nothing against the fact, which speaks loud and clear, that without the acceptance of what we call anthroposophically oriented spiritual science, the culture of humanity must sink into the abyss, and the work on earth must fall to powers that will not include humanity in their further development in the world. Things will not go otherwise unless enough people fill themselves with what I have just tried to say, and healing in this direction can be brought to humanity. For only those who absolutely will not look at what is happening in the world as a result of these last catastrophic years can close their eyes to the fact that we are starting out on the road to ruin, and that only something new can lead us away from this path. Whatever one may look for within this destructive process itself can never become anything else but a force of destruction. Now, only what will really draw on sources that have not belonged to the earth's development up till now can bring about a force for reconstruction. but there are significant difficulties standing in the way of obtaining results from such sources. It is often said that the science of initiation could not without reservation be brought to humanity because a particular kind of reception is necessary for it. You see, again and again, people listen to this, but again and again, this is also just what is always being sinned against. Let us take only a very simple example. One of the very first, most elementary requirements for receiving the science of initiation is that those who receive it must try to overcome what, for example, could be called a desire to be looked up to, in particular when they express a judgment comparing their own personality with that of other people. Now, it is quite easy to see that just in what we call the Anthroposophical Society, what would be the point of not saying it? It is admitted over and over again that this is right. But we see that just the most disagreeable things exist within a movement such as the anthroposophical one, that just in it opposing intrigues and mutual envy take root. I will only just point out these manifestations. For today I must speak of the other, even greater difficulties facing the introduction of initiation science into the culture of the earth. You see, to begin with, what has to be shown to humanity in a comprehensive way is what one could call the mystery of the human will. This mystery has been hidden from the culture of humanity in recent times, especially since the middle of the 15th century, since the beginning of the 5th post-Atlantean epoch. One can say the worldview of humanity knows almost nothing about the will. We have often characterized it. The human individual never experiences the actual nature of the will during waking consciousness. Awake, human beings experience the nature of their conceptions. In dreaming, the nature of their feelings. But even when awake, they are partly asleep with regard to the will. We go through the world as so-called awake human beings, but are only awake to our conceptions, half awake, dreaming in our feelings, and are completely asleep to the will. Let us not deceive ourselves about this. We have conceptions about our willing, but only when the will becomes a conception, only when the will is portrayed to the intelligence, do we experience it when awake. What is going on there in the depths of the human being, even when we only raise a hand, which means setting our will into motion, of that the normal person of today knows nothing at all. This means that the mystery of the will is completely unknown to human beings of today, and this is really connected with the fact that our whole recent culture, especially what has developed since the 15th century, is a culture of the mind, because the culture of natural science is a culture of the mind. In everything that we grasp with the intellect, that we pursue with the mind, the will has the least part to play. Whenever we think, when we imagine, the will, of course, also plays a part in our imagining, but in a very, very refined way. We are unaware of the pulsation of the will in our imagining, or how else the will functions in our being. In a certain way, it is due to the exclusively intellectual culture of recent times that the mystery of the will is completely hidden from the people of this time. If one now approaches the investigation of the will with those means of spiritual science that I have often spoken of here, that is to say, if one tries to enliven, with the help of imagination and inspiration, those forces that can see into the workings, that become active when the human being wills, then one realizes that in our physical life, between birth and death, the will is essentially connected not with the upbuilding processes, but with those of disintegration. If in our brain only upbuilding processes were at work, if only, for example, what is done by the nourishment taken up by the life forces were at work, then we would not be able to develop a soul and spiritual life through the instrument of our nerves and brain. It is only because of the continual process of breaking down or disintegration in our brain that the soul and spiritual element can secure a place in what is disintegrating. But this is just where the will is at work. The will of the human being is essentially something that during our physical life is already partly working for our death. Regarding our head organization, we are constantly dying. Every moment we are dying. We only live because the rest of our organism works against this constant dying of the head. But it is the will, above all else, that is active in this dying of the head. In our head continually takes place what, apart from ourselves, is objectively happening in the world outside when we have passed through physical death. Our corpse really is of no concern to us, to the extent that we are human individualities and are entering the soul spiritual worlds through the gate of death, but it is of great concern to the universe, because this corpse is delivered in some form to the elements of the earth, through cremation or burial. It does not really matter how. There, in its own way, it continues to do what our human will partially does in our nerve system, our sensory system, during the life between birth and death. We can imagine and think, due to our will destroying something in us. We give our corpse over to the earth, and with the help of this disintegrating corpse, which merely continues the same process that we were partially carrying out during our life, the whole earth imagines and thinks, so to speak. What goes on continuously in the earth through the reciprocal activity between the earth and the dead corpses, I once characterized this to you from other points of view some months ago, is an activity that is quite similar in character to the will activity continually at work unconsciously in our nerve and sensory system in breaking down, disintegrating, and working toward a corpse-like condition between birth and death. It is the same will that between birth and death works by means of disintegration, by connecting itself with our I, that same will within the boundaries of our skin that after our death works cosmically through our corpse in the thinking and imagination of the whole earth. Thus we are cosmically connected with what one can call the soul spiritual process of the whole of earth's existence. This concept is of great weight, for it concretely places the human being in the cosmic aspect of our earth existence. This demonstrates how related the human will is to what the forces of death are doing in our earth existence. It shows the relationship of the human will to the working of the general world will in disintegration and in bringing about the conditions for death on the earth. But just as our continuing development in the spiritual world after we die depends on not having a physical body anymore, on not working with bodily forces but with other ones, so does a thriving further development of the whole earth depend on whether humanity unites itself not with these death forces, but with life forces that develop themselves in a different direction than these death forces. To say this before humanity of today, so filled with personal intentions and feelings, is already something rather severe, because the seriousness of such a truth is felt today only to a very limited degree. Humanity has indeed forgotten how to take great truths with the necessary deep seriousness. But despite that, it must further be asked, how then is what lies in the human will, as I have described it, actually connected with the disintegration processes in outer nature? It is here, we might say, where the greatest illusion confronts the human being of today. What does a human being actually do when looking at nature? Yes, there is a natural process taking place. Before, another process took place that is its cause. Before that again another one, and so on. In this way, modern people find a chain of causes and effects in nature and are very proud of it when they comprehend the outer world by following the thread of causality. What comes about from this? Well, ask any conscientious geologist, physicist, chemist, or any other orthodox natural scientist, though they may often shy away from drawing the ultimate conclusions based on their view of the world, whether they do not have to imagine that the earth, the stones, plants, and many animals too, would have developed just as they have if the human being had not been there, if no houses, no machines, no airships had been built by the buffaloes, bulls, and so on. Everything else that today we do not consider the work of human beings would all have been there from the beginning to end, even if the human beings had not been there, because in outer nature there exists a chain of causes and effects. What came later is the result of what came before. And actually the human being was not there at the formation of this chain of events, according to present-day opinion. This view contains exactly the same error as the following. Imagine that I write a sentence on the blackboard, "Stuttgart is a city." Now somebody comes across this sentence and says that they will scientifically investigate what they find written on this blackboard. Starting from the back, we first find a letter Y. Then comes out of the T. Then the T comes out of the preceding I. The I out of the preceding C, and so on. Each time we have the effect of the preceding cause. The Y is the effect of the T is the effect of the I, and so forth. You see, it is nonsense. Each letter only exists because I have written it, and the preceding letter did not, of course, create the subsequent one. A thorough, unprejudiced examination of the character of the processes in nature will convince us of the same. We say, under the great illusion of contemporary science, effects are the result of their causes. It is not so. In nature, we must look for the actual causes elsewhere, just as we must look for the cause for the sequence of letters in our understanding. And where, by and large, lie the causes for what happens in nature? Only through spiritual perception can we determine that the causes lie with humanity. Do you know where you must look if you want to see the real causes for the development of nature on the earth? You must investigate how the will, deeply asleep in our present state of consciousness, is located in the center of gravity of the human being, that is, in the abdomen. Only a portion of the will is active in the human head, and the greater part of it is centered in the rest of the organism. What comes into existence as the outer development of nature depends on what the human being is in relation to this unconscious will. Up to now, we could only quote one significant case in this development, but it applies to the whole of it. I have often drawn your attention to the fact that during the time of Atlantis, people devoted themselves to a kind of black magic. As a result, the Ice Age spread over the civilized world. But in a most comprehensive sense, everything in the development of nature is in reality the result of the will activity, not of a single human being, but of the working together of various will forces coming from the human centers of gravity. If a sufficiently developed being were to study the Earth, let us say from Mars or Mercury, in order to understand how the development of nature takes place here, then this being would not describe nature as would a person who wants to seem educated. Such a being would look over the earth and say, "Down there on the earth are many points where the forces that bring about the development of nature are centered." But for this being, these points would not lie outside in nature, but always inside the human beings. Someone looking from outside would feel they must look at what is within humanity if they want to seek the causes for what happens in the development of nature. This insight into the relationship of human will activity with the overall development of nature will have to become an integral part of the future natural science of humanity. Of course, we can be deceived if we only observe the development of nature as far as the end of our nose. Then, of course, the relationship will not be apparent. With such a natural science, human beings will feel themselves responsible for what they are in quite a different way than they generally feel today. From being a citizen of the earth, human beings will become cosmic citizens. They will learn to regard themselves as belonging to the cosmos. But consider that just as soon as one draws attention to such things, the knowledge of them becomes part of us. This knowledge is not like the shadow of our intellectual knowledge, but is derived much more from the reality of things, and therefore it works in a way that is much more real. And since it works in a more real way than the shadow-like knowledge of present-day humanity, it is then necessary that human beings take seriously what is revealed through this knowledge. One cannot remain a citizen of the cosmos in the sense just described on the one hand, and on the other still remain the old kind of pedant that the last few centuries, since the middle of the 15th century, have produced in the humanity of today. One cannot, on the one hand, want to become a participant in cosmic events, and on the other hand indulge in frequent gossip sessions about our fellow human beings, as has been happening in the bourgeois times since the middle of the 15th century. It is necessary that another ethos, other moral impulses find their way throughout humanity, if at the same time the science of initiation is to enter in a serious way. For today, a special hindrance to the entry of this initiation science is everything that is unrighteously preparing for the appearance of Ahriman on our earth. I have just recently referred to this fact in order to characterize a little for you the right festival mood for this year's Christmas. I will now briefly recapitulate. When we go back in the history of the earth, then we find, before our present materialistic culture, the Greco-Roman culture, going back to the 8th century BCE. We see appearing a few centuries after the beginning of this Greco-Roman period what we might call the old life of wisdom of ancient times, at that time already filtered in the land of Greece. Nietzsche had strange, even morbid feelings in this connection. From the beginning of his intellectual work, he felt himself to be an opponent of Socrates, and he never tired to speak again and again of the greater worth of the pre-Socratic Greek culture as compared with the Socratic and post-Socratic. I will not enter into this matter further, other than to say to you, it is certainly true that on the one hand a great epoch of humanity began with Socrates, one that found its culmination in the transition of the 14th and 15th centuries. But for this age of Socrates, time has now run out, really run out. The Socratic epoch took from the prior impulsive wisdom merely the logic, the dialectic. This taking of only the logic from the old clairvoyant wisdom is the characteristic of our Western culture. It has also left its stamp on Christianity, because the theology of the West is also a dialectical one. But what comes up in Greece as dialectic, as spirituality filtered to abstraction, goes back to the mysteries of the East. And with these mysteries were also those that founded the culture that later became the Chinese culture, within which Lucifer incarnated. This should not be concealed, that Lucifer himself was once in a body, just as the Christ wandered about the earth in a body at the time of the mystery of Golgotha. But one pedantically misunderstands this Luciferic incarnation when one wants to regard everything that came out of Lucifer as a kind of touch-me-not. From Lucifer, for example, the height of Greek culture itself came about, the real art of that time, and humanity's impulse for art, the way we actually still think about it. But in Europe, all of that has become frozen into phrases and devoid of content. And it was through Luciferic wisdom that Christianity first became understood in Europe. That is what is significant, that in Greek wisdom, which developed as a gnosis to understand the mystery of Golgotha, the old Luciferic wisdom was also at work and gave form to the ancient gnosis. At that time it was Christianity's greatest victory, that the mystery of Golgotha clothed itself in what Lucifer gave to the world. But while the culture of Lucifer, which was given to humanity through his actual incarnation, was ebbing away, the tide was gradually rising for what was preparing for the future incarnation of Ahriman on the earth, When the time is ripe, and it is preparing itself for that, Ahriman will incarnate in the West in a human body. This event must take place, just as Lucifer and Christ had to incarnate. This fact is prescribed for the development of the earth. What is important is only this: to face up to the fact as to properly prepare for it. For Ahriman will not wait to act until he appears on the earth as a human being, but he is already preparing in the supersensible worlds for his appearance. He is already working into the development of humanity, and from where he is now, he seeks the tools to prepare himself for what is to come. Now, an essential way to achieve a favorable effect of what Ahriman is to bring to humanity, he will bring positive things, the same as Lucifer, is that humanity has the right attitude to it. It all depends on humanity not sleeping through his appearance. When the incarnated Ahriman appears in the West, the birth record will say, John William Smith is born. Of course, that won't be his name. And people will look upon him as a good citizen, just like other citizens, and they will be unaware of what is actually happening. Our university professors will quite certainly not take care that we are awake for this. For them, what will appear there will be John William Smith. But what is important is that in this Ahrimanic age, people know that only outwardly will we be dealing with John William Smith, and that inwardly Ahriman is present. We cannot let ourselves be deceived and sleepily deluded by what is going on. Yes, already now, we must not be under any illusion that these things are being prepared. Among the most important means that Ahriman has to work down from the other world is this: to promote the abstract thinking of humanity. And because this abstract thinking is so popular these days, people are well paving the way for the appearance of Ahriman in ways favorable to him. For Ahriman to trap the whole earth into his own development, nothing could better prepare than pursuing this life of abstraction, which today has even penetrated the social life. That is one of the feints, one of the tricks, whereby Ahriman thinks to prepare for his mastery of the earth. Instead of showing people from actual experience what should be done, they are told about general theories, about social theories. Those who talk about theories find what comes just from experience to be abstract, because they haven't the least notion about real life. All of this is the Ahrimanic way of preparation. But there is still another way of preparing for Ahriman. This is also something that people today now need to know about, which can happen through an erroneous conception of the Gospels. Of course, you know there are numerous people today, especially among the official representatives of one or other of the denominations, who are fighting tooth and nail just against what is coming out from the science of initiation to give us a new understanding of Christ. Such people, if they don't only do homage to rationalism, still accept the Gospels. But what do they know about the actual nature of the Gospels? People of this kind were just the ones who applied the outer, worldly, historic, scientific method to the Gospels in the 19th century. And what happened to these Gospels, using the scientific method of the 19th century? Nothing, except that this conception of the Gospels gradually became materialized. The first thing that was noted was the contradictions contained in the four Gospels, and then, from the perception of these contradictions, a downward slide took place to what I call Schmiedelei. For in the end, what is all that comes out of the gospel research of Schmiedel from Basel? I mean the theologian Professor Schmiedel, not our Dr. Schmiedel. What is this? I would like to say, other than taking the Gospels off their hinges. What is dear old Schmiedel looking for in the Gospels? He is seeking to prove that they are not just products of fantasy, only intended to glorify Christ Jesus, and arrives at a limited number of points, Schmiedel's famous main points, in which unfavorable things were also said about the Christ. These, he thinks, would have been left out if the Gospels had only been written for the glorification of Jesus. So one finally has the feeling that he enters into everything where Christ Jesus is portrayed in a negative light, in order to salvage a tiny bit of conventional knowledge for the Gospels, but even this tiny bit will fall away. Nothing will be won from conventional knowledge that will be able to prove the authenticity of the Gospels in the way these gentlemen would like. To have the right attitude to these Gospels, one would have to know why they came to exist. In other words, one would have to know what they actually want. This we will only come to recognize with minds really fructified by what can emerge from spiritual science. But if we enter deeply into the Gospels, if we absorb their content and their power, then we come to the point of gaining a soul content from them. No outer knowledge of history will solve their riddles for us, but we can penetrate deeply into them and then receive a content for the soul. This soul content is a great hallucination, a refined hallucination to be sure. The hallucination of the of the mystery of Golgotha. The greatest thing that can be gained from the Gospels is the hallucination of the mystery of Golgotha, nothing more and nothing less. You see, this secret is just what is known to the newer Catholic Church. Therefore the Church doesn't want laymen to finally know about the Gospels, because it is afraid they might then realize that one cannot get an historical account of the Christ mystery from the Gospels, but only an hallucination of this mystery of Golgotha. I could also call it an imagination, because the hallucination is so refined that it is a real imagination. But it is not possible to gain more than an imagination from the Gospel content itself. What is the way from the imagination to the reality? The way is opened up, you see, through spiritual science. Not through what lies outside spiritual science, but through spiritual science alone. Which means the imagination of the Gospels must be raised to reality through spiritual science. It is in Ahriman's utmost interest to so prepare his incarnation that human beings do not find the way through spiritual science from the imagination in the Gospels to the reality of the mystery of Golgotha. Just as Ahriman has the greatest interest to preserve the sense for the abstract, so does he also have the greatest interest that humanity more and more develops the kind of piety that is merely based on the Gospels. If you think about that, you will understand that a great many of the denominations of the present time are paving the way for the realization of Ahriman's purposes on the earth. How could one better serve Ahriman than if one decided to utilize an available external power in order to command those who believe in that power and submit to it that they should not read anthroposophical literature? One could certainly not do Ahriman a greater service than to bring it about that a number of people do not read anthroposophical literature. These people who have decided to go the way of anthroposophy have to acquaint themselves with it. There are some facts that just cannot be put in any way other than without reservation and in the light of the truth. It must be realized that the course of world development is moving toward the incarnation of Ahriman, which will be taking place in the not-so-distant future. The course of world development went from Lucifer's incarnation thousands of years ago and passed through the mystery of Golgotha, whose working still continues. Ahriman's incarnation must stand in the way of this development, so that through opposition the forces embraced by the Christ impulse are strengthened. Through a veiled cult of the Gospels and through abstraction, Ahriman will be helped on his way. Due to an inner need for comfort, many people today shut themselves off from these serious matters. Anthroposophists should not do so. They should rather develop an impetus to do as much as possible for the spread of spiritual science in humanity. It is quite wrong when it is constantly believed that one needs to reach an understanding with people like Traub. It is senseless to believe that one could come to an understanding with such people, because they don't want to. What is important is to enlighten the rest of humanity about these people, so that they can come to an understanding with us. Truly, it is for that reason that everything has come about. They would only need, without prejudice, to read what is there, to plunge deep into what is there. One must strictly distinguish between the characteristics of those people who do harm to the further development of humanity, and the others to whom we must step up and tell them about the wrongdoers. Any attempt to arrive at an understanding with such people is quite pointless and has no meaning, for these people will only incline toward an understanding when they no longer have any followers who give them something to stand on. Then they are of themselves quite ready to reach an understanding. The primary necessity consists just in enlightening people about them. If only the striving to reach compromises in this connection did not unfortunately often exist just within our own circles, if only there was the courage for the absolute truth in this connection, it is quite unnecessary for us to ever be under the illusion of bringing about an understanding with this or that person who doesn't want an understanding with us at all. Would it be of any help to us? What is necessary for us is to stand up courageously for the truth as much as we can, and that, it seems to me, arises quite especially out of the conception of what is connected with human development. The end of Lecture 3. This is a reading of a collection of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for New Year 1920. It is the Collected Works, Volume 195. This is Lecture 4, given in Stuttgart, December 31st, 1919. On this evening, it always behooves us to think of how past and future are linked together and connected with all of the cosmic life into which the human being is woven. We think of how past and future are intertwined in every part of our lives because of all our own individual being was able to do and to think during the bygone year and what it may intend in the year ahead. With our anthroposophical spiritual science in mind, we should penetrate those thoughts we must have about our actions of the past year, and what we intend to do in the coming year with the requisite seriousness and dignity, by seeing them in a higher light, through what we can absorb in a spiritual scientific way, through a consideration of the great cosmic events. How does our life actually relate to the past and future? It is like a mirror. Yes, this comparison with a mirror corresponds much more to reality than we might at first imagine. In fact, we stand as if in front of a mirror, just when we are striving for a little self-knowledge. What is being reflected in the mirror is the part of the past that we know about, and behind the mirror lies what for now cannot be looked at, no more than you can see what lies behind a mirror when standing in front of it. Perhaps we have to especially raise the question here, what actually is the reflecting coating in our world mirror that allows what is transparent to become a mirror? In a spatial mirror, the back of the glass is coated so that our vision cannot penetrate this glass. What then coats that world mirror, which shows us a reflection of the past but hides the future behind itself for the time being? It is coated, my dear friends, with our own being, coated with our humanness. We need only consider that with ordinary knowledge we are in fact unable to become clear about what we ourselves are. We cannot look through ourselves. We look through ourselves no more than we can look through a mirror. Much is reflected back to us when we look into ourselves. What we have experienced and learned is reflected, but our own being hides itself, because we can no more look through into our own self than we can look through an actual mirror. Considered overall, and I would like to say in the abstract, we can regard this mirror comparison the way I have now presented it, but in a particular case it does become somewhat modified. Looking back on our life is indeed like a mirror regarding what is reflected by our inmost soul. But we must admit to ourselves that only a part of what we have experienced is reflected there. When you try to look back at your experiences, they are continually being interrupted. You look back at what today brought to you, but not at what was brought by the night before. Let me read that again. You look back at what today brought to you, but not at what was brought by the night before. The experiences of the night are an interruption. And again you look back at yesterday, but not at the night before yesterday, and so forth. There is a continual intervention of the nighttime experiences not included in one's thoughts. We are deceived when we look back and believe we are looking over our whole life. We, so to speak, piece together only what the days contain, and our life's course passes before our soul with constant interruptions. We can now ask ourselves, are these interruptions in the course of our life necessary? Yes, they are necessary. If we did not have these interruptions in the course of our life, or rather in the retrospect of our life, we would not, as human beings, become aware of our I capital. We would see the course of our life only filled up by the outer world, and the I consciousness would not enter into our life at all. That we perceive and feel our I comes from the fact that the course of our life is constantly broken up by interruptions. The humanity of the present stands in a critical time, just with regard to this perceiving of the I brought about by the interruptions in the continuity of life. When someone of today looks back and experiences their I through the retrospective way just described, then this I is empty in a certain respect. We only know about our own I. The people of former epochs knew more. In the way dreams come shimmering out for the individual during the day from experiences during the night, so the atavistic clairvoyant perceptions only had the form of dreams. What they contained were realities. One can say the I has been emptied of its atavistic clairvoyant content that supported people of bygone epochs, which penetrated them with the conviction that they had something in common and were connected with something divine. Out of the atavistic clairvoyant visions arose for human beings what condensed in their life of feelings into a religious perception and veneration of those to whom the religious cult and religious acts of offering were dedicated. How does the matter stand today? Today the I is empty of these atavistic clairvoyant visions, and when we look back at the I, it is, so to speak, more or less only a point in our soul life. The content of this I is a firm point of support for everyone, but still only a point. But we are also living in a time when the point should once again become a circle, in which the I should once again receive a content. Since the last third of the 19th century, the spirit world has been reaching so mightily into the sense world in order for the I to have a content once more. That is why since the 1870s, the spiritual world, with its revelations, wants to enter once again into our physical existence in a new way. And what we want, based on the ground of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science, is to willingly take up and put into a humanly communicable form what wants to enter in through spiritual revelations from another world, but one which is supporting ours. What is it that wants to enter in? It is nothing less than what, in a certain respect, guarantees the future of humankind. It is, we could say, not a direct look behind the mirror, but it is a guarantee that when humanity hastens toward the future, which means to set out on the way behind the mirror, what we must do in the future can vigorously take place. What all human beings have to accomplish when we have steeled and strengthened our forces through what is revealed to us from the spiritual world in a spiritual scientific way. Just as the I was filled for the human being of the past with atavistic clairvoyant content that guaranteed a connection with the divine, so in our time our I should fill itself with a new spiritual content received in full consciousness, which once again provides the tie that binds our soul to the soul being of the divine. What remained behind as the last inheritance of the old atavistic clairvoyance is the abstract thinking and abstract knowledge of the people of today. This remained behind as a dilution of the previous atavistic clairvoyance. People of today can have the feeling that this dilution, this logical, dialectical dilution of the old atavistic clairvoyant nature, can no longer be born in the soul. Then we will experience a longing to receive something new in our eye. But now a start must be made with what has formed the end of the development of humanity from ancient times up to the present. In those ancient times, humanity had clairvoyant revelations and did not understand them. Only later did they learn to do so. Today, human beings must first understand, must exert their intellect, and when they exert it through what spiritual science offers, then humanity will once again develop toward the clairvoyant perception of the spiritual. However, this is something that most people today still prefer to avoid, to apply their sound human understanding to comprehend spiritual science. If one wanted to avoid doing that, then one would also want to avoid allowing spiritual revelations to enter our earthly world altogether. Thus past and future are linked together on this present New Year's, or cosmic New Year's Day. It is really a kind of cosmic New Year, what we have today. The future lies like an enormous question before us, not like a vague, abstract question, but as a concrete question. How do we approach what has wanted to enter our earthly world ever more and more as a question to humanity, even as a spiritual revelation, ever since the last third of the 19th century? And how should we relate this to what has been revealed in the past? This would have to be perceived in a living way, and then one would feel what significance it has to give way to one's longing for an anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. Then one would feel the seriousness and dignity of spiritual scientific striving. Just at the present time it would be necessary to have this feeling, because we don't really appeal to something arbitrary in the human being, rather to what wants to reveal itself as knowledge of the world, out of the development of the world itself. We appeal to what the gods want with humanity, so to speak. But the fact is that when one turns to the Spirit on the one hand, then on the other, those people who want only to worship what was in the past are drawn toward the spirit of contradiction or opposition. And the more we attempt to take hold of the spirit of what is to be the future of humanity, the more will the people looking to the past be obsessed by the spirit of opposition. In humanity today, it is noticeable how religious feeling is trying to imbue new life into itself. It consists mostly of fumbling attempts. Spiritual scientific attempts should not be fumbling ones. Through them, the real concrete spirit world should be taken hold of. But I would like to say, people stand before us as if they had a notion of that, and they say, the mere religious tradition is not enough for us. We want to have an inner religious experience. We don't only want to have the information that according to tradition and reports handed down, Christ lived in Palestine so and so many years ago and that he died. We want to experience the Christ experience in our own souls. In many areas we see such things occurring in people who believe that something of the Christ experience arose in their inmost soul. They are fumbling attempts that are often even questionable, because then the people are right away satisfied in their self-seeking souls and reject any inclination toward the Spirit. But they are there, these longings for inner spiritual experience. And attention should also be paid to such quite fumbling attempts at inner spiritual experience, to a new interest in the spiritual world. But then the opposing spirits begin to stir. After what has been printed about this, and after what such a representative of the spirit of the past has himself printed, he himself was recently supposed to have said some rather remarkable words here in Stuttgart about these attempts. On the one hand, they are fumbling attempts to bring about a new religious interest and experience. and on the other are attempts to arrive at really new concrete knowledge of the spiritual world in the way one tries to validate it through anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. I don't know how many of you saw the shepherd's play that was recently performed in the Waldorf school, where the one shepherd says he was almost dumbfounded because he had a spiritual vision. Well, when I read the last page of Gogarten's, quote, Spiritual Science and Christianity, unquote, I must say I was also almost dumbfounded, because one stands in amazement before the fact that it is possible that such things can be said at the present time. Just such things should stimulate one to consider a cosmic new year, to compare what is in the past with what is necessary in the future. For what did that man of religion actually say? I don't know if its heavy import was entirely understood. He said, quote, "It is today. Why am I saying today? It is always the most important task of piety to preserve those basic elements of which I spoke. Today we are almost completely lacking in that. We are stuck in religious interest and in religious experience. And since anthroposophy is such good material for interest and such a good medium for experience, one is hard put to be able to resist it. One knows just so little any more of that ultimate basic tension that is brought into life by piety, which drives away every religious interest and destroys every religious experience. This tension between God and creature. And because one knows so little of this tension, therefore one knows just as little of the unconditional direct oneness of God and man." Unquote. Here we see every religious interest denigrated, every religious experience destroyed in the name of religion, and a quite vague tension, which of course cannot be further differentiated, which he does not want to differentiate any further, is supposed to take the place of religious interest and experience. One could become speechless when a representative of religion speaks in such a way, saying that true piety should drive away every religious interest, destroy every religious experience. So far have we come. And so far have we come that we do not perceive what lies behind it, when an official representative of religion says, "Away with religious interest, away with religious experience." You see, this man doesn't realize that he himself could never speak of religion if earlier there had not been atavistic religious interest and experience, that the gentleman could not stand in front of listeners as an official representative of religion if religion had not entered human development by way of religious interest and experience. And apart from all that, what I have just brought before you points to the fact that today just those people who fancy themselves to be the true representatives of religious life are working for the destruction of religion's very existence. Have then these people lost any capacity to understand the human soul? Can these people no longer understand that everything that the human beings turn their attention to must be led by their interest? That everything that enters their consciousness must be carried by experience? It is even as if the human being no longer speaks out of such a consciousness, but only from the spirit of opposition. That is what, in all seriousness, should stand before our soul when we look into the mirror that so mysteriously uncovers the past and hides the future, yet still reveals it in a certain way that I have explained. It is there that anthroposophically oriented spiritual science wants to serve the religious interest, that it wants to bring content into religious experience. And what happens? You see, during this year the question was put before the Holy Congregation of Cardinals whether the teachings, today referred to as anthroposophy, can be reconciled with Catholic teachings, and whether it is permitted to join theosophical societies, attend theosophical meetings, and to read theosophical journals and newspapers. The answer was no to every point, negative in omnibus. This is the spirit of opposition, and the Jesuit, Zimmermann, particularly interprets this decree of the Holy Congregation as applying to anthroposophy. Now, what this Zimmermann writes is probably familiar to you, and I don't need especially to explain it to you, but you must all surely know what wind, filled with the spirit of opposition, is blowing from a certain quarter today against anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. What kind of spirit is passing through the world in this wind? One can also feel it when one knows that the following words come from the pen of that same Zimmermann, who for years perpetuated the lie that I was formerly a priest who left the church. Quote, with the defection of its general secretary, Dr. Rudolf Steiner, who took most of its members with him, the Theosophical Society, although initially very weakened, recovered itself somewhat over the years, and now has about 25 lodges, about a fifth of which are dormant, and in Düsseldorf it publishes Theosophical Striving as its voice in Germany and Austria. The people around him complained that Steiner, who after his defection called his theosophy anthroposophy, was becoming sterile, that he had no more visions, and was always lecturing about the same things, and would presumably soon latch onto something new, unquote, and so forth. And then there appears a subsequent article in which the threefold idea is dealt with in an equally clever way. You see, what kind of spirit of truth lies behind this Jesuit? What Jesuits say is not just their personal opinion, but the opinion of the Catholic Church, because each of them only speaks as one of its members. Therefore, what he says relates back to the Catholic Church. Today, these things must also be judged from a moral point of view. From a moral point of view, one must ask whether someone who deals with the truth as he does, a man who, in the present circumstances, is indeed highly regarded within a particular religious community here on the earth, could be so regarded by the true spirit of humanity. As long as questions of that kind cannot be addressed with the necessary seriousness, we have not yet arrived at a proper consideration of the cosmic new year. But it is necessary today that we arrive at a proper consideration of the cosmic new year. It is necessary that we extend the so-called compassion, which unfortunately often arises from egoistic sources, to the greater conditions of humanity, and feel the compassion for humanity that will urge us on to make a spiritual movement like this one really fruitful for the development of humanity. Could you feel just on this day, my dear friends, that it is really the spirit of the world itself that for decades has wanted to enter in? Could you feel on this evening that here is a willingness to serve this spirit who wants to enter into humanity? Could you feel that this spirit is to be served here, so that the souls of those who want to feel and to think together with this anthroposophically oriented spiritual science feel united with the new spirit that wants to enter the world, this spirit that alone can bring an impulse of regeneration out of heaven to the self-destroying earthly world? In this hour, which in every year is symbolic, because in a way it calls upon us to experience it as the hour separating the past and the future, may you unite your souls with the new spirit, and experience in your souls that here the touching of the past year with the year to come is the touching of the world year that is ending its course with the world year that is about to spring forth. But the passing world year will still send its after effects into the future. They will be destructive forces of a spiritual, legal, and economic kind. And it will be all the more necessary that as many people as possible will be taken up in the depths of their soul by the new year of a spiritual future, and will develop a will that can be the basis of building a new spiritual world into the future development of humanity. Those who want to kill off religious interest, who want to do away with religious experience, will not care for the future of humanity. Only those who see how through our intellectual age the old religious interest has died away, the old religious life has been lamed, will see how a new religious experience must sprout up in humanity, so that human beings can bear the seeds of a future existence into the cosmos. The end of Lecture 4. This is a reading of a set of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for New Year 1920, Collected Works, Volume 195. This is the last lecture in this set, Lecture 5, given in Stuttgart, January 1st, 1920. Today I would like to appear before you with New Year's greetings that contain what I would like to wish into your souls, what the present time needs so very much. May you recognize the great urgent demands for the development of humankind, and may you cooperate, each in your own place, and as much as you are able, in the fulfillment of what is so greatly needed by humanity in our time. At such a time that symbolically expresses the confluence of past and future, I may perhaps be allowed to refer to something that I believe, even though it is connected with personal experiences, has a certain significance for looking into the whole spiritual constitution of the present time. My dear friends, in the near future, essays of mine are to appear that I wrote a long time ago, some of them more than 30 years ago. Those essays that I wrote while still in Austria were collected through the love shown by our friend Dr. Kalisko in undertaking this collection. Today, in this consideration of the new year, which may rightly also be a consideration of the times, I would like, as an introduction, to point out some of the things from those essays. What was written at that time was done in order to speak to the conscience, one can really say, of the German people, in order to give expression to what could then be perceived as a basic deficiency in the spiritual life of this German people. Allow me to read a few of these sentences, now more than 30 years old, from the article entitled, quote, "The Spiritual Signature of the Present," unquote. They point to a past of 30 years ago, which then was the present. Standing within those symptoms of the general spiritual life that revealed itself mostly in the intellectual life of the nation, I wrote at that time, quote, "With a shrug of the shoulder, our present generation recalls that time when a philosophical impulse passed through all of German spiritual life, the mighty impulse of the time which took hold of human spirits at the end of the last and the beginning of this century, and which boldly set itself the highest thinkable tasks, now is ranked as a regrettable mistake. Whoever dares to take an opposing view when the talk is of Fichte's fantastic notions or of Hegel's unreal playing with thoughts and words is simply put down as a dilettante, quote, who has as little conception of the spirit of today's natural science as of the purity and strictness of the philosophical method," unquote. At most, Kant and Schopenhauer find favor with our contemporaries. The former succeeds in apparently deriving from his teachings the rather sparse philosophical crumbs that form the basis of modern science. The latter, besides his strictly scientific efforts, has also written works in an easy style and about things that are not beyond people with the most modest of spiritual horizons. But for that, striving for the highest levels of the thought world, for that buoyancy of spirit that paralleled our classical cultural epoch, there is now lacking any sense or understanding. The seriousness of this phenomenon only becomes apparent when one considers that a lasting turning away from that spiritual direction would be for the Germans a loss of their self, a break with the folk spirit. For this striving arose from a deep need of the German character. It does not occur to us to want to deny the numerous mistakes made and biased opinions held by Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, Oken, and others in their bold undertakings in the realm of idealism. But we should not be mistaken about the sublime tendency that ensouled them, so right and fitting in a nation of thinkers. What characterizes the German is not the living sense for the immediate reality, for the external side of nature, which enabled the Greeks to produce their glorious imperishable creations. It is instead an incessant urgency of the spirit to find the reason for things, to find the apparently hidden deeper causes of the nature that surrounds us. While the Greek spirit lived itself out in its wonderful world of forms and figures, the Germans, more withdrawn into themselves and having interaction less with nature, but therefore more with their heart and their own inner being, had to seek their conquests in the sphere of the world of pure thought. Therefore it was the German way in which Fichte and his successors confronted life and the world, and therefore their teachings had such an enthusiastic reception, and for a time the whole life of the nation was seized by it. But also, therefore, we must not break away from this direction of the spirit, overcoming the mistakes, but a natural development on the basis that was established then, must be our watchword, not what those spirits found or thought they had found, but how they faced up to the problems of research. That is of lasting value." End quote. At that time it should have been pointed out to the German people what was now threatening to disappear from their view. In those days one still lived in a different time than today. One lived in a time when it would have still been possible in certain circles, if one had wanted to connect oneself with the spirit that was beginning to decline, and to act decisively to open a way for the development of new human impulses. However, human beings would have had to have been found then amongst those who called themselves leaders of the people, amongst those who were giving guidance to the youth for their later life. At that time, there were no experiments of the kind that are now appearing in Russia. At that time, those who were educators of the youth would have had the ability to turn back to the intentions of that former spiritual life and to let it arise again in a new form. But in those days, no one wanted in the least to listen to a voice that spoke for such a revival of a truly spiritual striving of humanity. And everything that has characterized, especially the lower and higher educators of the people in these last 30 years, was an assault against the intentions of a spiritual view of the world. Today I must think about the fact that then, when I wrote those words, my interpretations of Goethe's worldview and his ideas about natural science had just been published. And I must think how I then made those who are active in the field of thinking and of scientific research aware of two great dangers. I then formulated two terms to characterize the two great enemies of human spiritual progress. On the one hand, I spoke of the dogma of revelation, and on the other hand, I spoke of the dogma of mere experience. I wanted to show that the one-sided cultivation of the dogma of revelation, as it has developed in confessional circles, is just as harmful as the boasting about the so-called dogmas of experience, which means all of what is only provided by the outer sense world and the world of material facts by the natural scientists and sociologists. It was then my task, in the course of time, to formulate these ideas more concretely and to point out the real forces that lie behind these phenomena. What lies behind what I called the dogma of revelation? All of what we today in a comprehensive way call the Luciferic influences on the course of human development. Whoever in our present time wants to lead humanity merely under the influence of the dogma of revelation is leading them in the sense of Lucifer. Whoever, perhaps the natural scientists, wants to lead them merely in the sense of outer sensory experience leads humanity in the sense of Ahriman. In our present serious time, it may not be a consideration for the new year to cast an eye over the last 3 to 4 decades, to point out that it is just as essential for us today to raise once more the call that was raised then, only in a much stronger way. My dear friends, by the course of external events, these 30 to 40 years have clearly shown how justified that call was at that time. Anyone who looks without prejudice at what has happened must say, if at that time such a call had become a reality in the minds of the people of Central Europe, what we now experience as misery and distress would not have come. At that time the call died away. Now one meets it coming from the Roman Holy Congregation in the decree of July 18, 1919, and the cathedral chaplains announce that my writings on anthroposophy may not be read because the Pope has forbidden it. So one must be instructed out of the writings of the opponents. The cathedral chaplains therefore refer not to my writings for knowledge about anthroposophy, but to those of Seiling and his collaborators. This is happening at the same time that under the auspices of a Berlin government with socialist leanings, negotiations are taking place for the establishment of a Roman Catholic nunciature in Berlin. This is also something that gives an indication of the spiritual signature of the present time. And today one would really like to appeal already to the deepest heart forces of those who are still capable of feeling something of the spiritual impulses inherent in the development of humanity, so that they may wake up and really see how things are actually going. For today it is a question, above all else, of people finding the possibility of coming to their own self. And to come to one's self requires confidence in one's own strength of soul. It is just with this appeal to one's strength of soul that it is hard today to reach people. On the one hand, people want to lean up against something that forces them from inside to think and want what is right. And on the other hand, they want to lean against something that forces them from the outside to think and want what is right. People somehow always tend toward two such extremes, and never want to exert themselves to strive for a balance between the forces emanating from these two extremes. Let us once more cast our eyes upon something of the spiritual signature of the present, which today is about to become a social and material signature. We hear arising in Eastern Europe the old Marxist cry, "A new social order must come about among people where each human being can live according to his or her abilities and his or her needs." A social order must be developed where the individual capacities of each human being become of value, and where the justifiable needs of each human being can be satisfied. When thus abstractly announced, there is nothing in the least objectionable about this abstraction. But on the other hand, we hear such a personality as Lenin say that such a social order cannot be established with the people of the present time. With them one can only set up a transitional social order. One can only establish something that, of course, will contain injustice in the widest sense. It is also present to an absurd degree in everything being established by Lenin and his followers. They believe one could only produce a new human race that does not yet exist by passing through this transitional phase. And when it comes to be, then one will be able to introduce into it that social order in which each person can make use of their capacities and live according to their needs. Thus they invent a non-existent human race in order to realize an idea that, as I said, is even justified in an abstract sense. But could enough people not be found who grasp the whole seriousness of the current world situation when they hear something like this? Is it not time for this sleepiness to cease, which closes its eyes a little when something like this appears, that in the deepest sense points to the signature of the present, closes its eyes in order not to fully take in the whole significance of such a thing in any way? To come to a concrete understanding about these things, nothing else helps than to abandon the ways of abstraction in the spiritual life. But for that one must really first have a feeling for where abstraction is present, when there is only talk in phrases about soul and spirit, and one must be able to discern when soul and spirit are talked about as a reality. You see, when one speaks of human capacities, they appear as a manifestation of the inner being of the developing person. Humanity is encouraged by a number of its representatives to appropriately develop the capacities and forces that appear in the maturing human being. We only perceive truly in this field if, in a certain way, we perceive the manifestation of these forces and capacities as a manifestation of the divine. We must say to ourselves, the human being has come out of a world of soul-spiritual being into this world of sensory reality. And what expresses itself there as human forces and capacities, and what we have developed in ourselves and in others, originates in a spiritual world. And having descended from a spiritual world into this physical human body, it has now been incorporated in this body. But if you take the spirit and sense of what has been explained here for decades, this spirit and sense points out to you that with the incorporation of human capacities and forces in the physical human body, the possibility is given to the Luciferic beings to access these capacities and forces. We cannot do anything with these human capacities and forces in the way of individual activity or activities in the sphere of education or culture without coming into touch with Luciferic forces. In those regions that the human being passes through before entering into physical existence through birth or conception, Luciferic powers could not directly approach the human capacities and forces. The incorporation in the human bodily system is the means whereby the Luciferic powers can approach human capacities and forces. Only by impartially facing up to this fact do we come to a right attitude in life to all that gushes forth in human nature as capacities and strengths. If we do not want to see the Luciferic, if we deny it, then we are trapped by it. But it is just then that we get into that state of mind that wants to deliver us entirely to something internally compelling, to be thus relieved by all kinds of mystical or religious powers from the necessity of appealing to the free self of the human being, and to seek the divine in the unfolding of our own free selves in the world. People don't want to think for themselves. They want a vague power to express themselves from their inner being, according to which they can prove themselves logical. They don't want to experience the truth. They don't want to exert themselves to have that inner free experience that also experiences the truth. They want to experience the inner compulsion that compels them from within and expresses itself in the proof that does not appeal to experience, but to the power of something spiritual that will overpower and force them to think this or that about nature and about the human being. But in appealing to this inner compulsion, this inner power, people are delivering themselves up to the Luciferic powers. The means that can be used so that people appeal to this compulsion, so that they do not raise themselves to stand freely within the spiritual world, are to forbid them to think that the human being consists of body, soul, and spirit, as was done by the 8th General Council of Constantinople, and to do away with any concern for the spirit. These are coincidences that must no longer be overlooked today, and must be clearly and impartially looked at. At that time, in the year 869, when it was decided that people must no longer believe in the spirit of the human being, the inclination toward Lucifer entered European civilization. And today we have the fulfillment of that. People have given in long enough to the inclination not to experience the truth, but to allow the compulsion of proof, of impersonal proof, to act upon them. That has thrown them to the other extreme. People have not learned to occupy themselves in a pertinent way with the human capacities and forces, and have not wanted to admit that Luciferic powers live in the human capacities and forces when they are incorporated in the physical body in the way I have just explained. Thereby people have experienced the wrong attitude toward the individual capacities and forces to which modern humanity has come, which is currently the order of the day. At the other pole of the human being are human needs, those needs that initially express themselves in the purely physical nature. In his title, Aesthetic Letters, Schiller contrasted these needs so beautifully with the abstract logical power and called them the essential need, Notdurft, while he characterized the logical compulsion as the other power, the power deviating into the spiritual. At that time, during the great period of German development, such a personality as Schiller was on the way to correctly understand the contrasting polarity of the human being. Then the time was not yet ripe to say more than was said by Schiller, Goethe, and those of like mind. Our new time is faced with the necessity to build these things further, and then it becomes anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. Those who only know the one-sided power of proof in the spiritual sphere in their lives also only learn to know the one-sided driving force of nature in human needs. You can easily imagine when human beings enter into the physical sensory world with their capacities and forces through conception or birth, and Lucifer comes over them and takes something that the human beings themselves should have on the one side, on the side of the head, so to speak, then there also remains for the human beings themselves a lesser capacity to assert their independence in the sphere of their needs. Through what Lucifer appropriates for himself on the one hand, Ahriman on the other hand gains the possibility of appropriating what is at work in the needs of human nature. And so, along with that possibility and the dogma of mere outer sensory experience, the door is opened to the penetration by Ahriman of the instinctive life of humanity in the last third of the 19th century. And so, in not realizing that healing lies in the equilibrium between the two extremes, between the capacities on the one hand and the needs on the other, modern humanity stands before a dreadful fact. Out of its materialistic mind, it only looks upon the body that produces the capacities, meaning only upon the Luciferic origin of the capacities, because through the fact that the capacities enter into the body, they become Luciferic. And when one believes that the capacities come from the body, then one believes in Lucifer. And when one believes the needs arise from the body, then one only believes in what is Ahrimanic in those needs. And what experiment is currently being made over in Eastern Europe under the guidance of the West? This guidance not only appears so obvious because Lenin and Trotsky are spiritual students of the West, but also because Lenin was dispatched to Russia in a leaded coach with Dr. Helphand, so that what is called Bolshevism was imported goods from the German government and the German High Command. What is being attempted there in the Eastern European culture? There it is attempted to eliminate everything that is human, everything that incorporates itself as human in the human body, to harness Lucifer and Ahriman together in their cultural purity. If this were realized today in the East, then a creation would result from the joint efforts of Ahriman and Lucifer, with the exclusion of everything appropriate to the human being. People would be harnessed into the Luciferic Ahrimanic culture like a part of a machine in the whole mechanism of this machine. Only a machine part is lifeless. Let me read that again. People would be harnessed into the Luciferic Ahrimanic culture like a part of a machine in the whole mechanism of this machine. Only a machine part is lifeless and lets itself be harnessed, while human nature is inwardly alive, ensouled, and inspirited, and does not fit into a merely Luciferic Ahrimanic organization, and therefore must perish. Only through spiritual science can we understand what is actually happening today in this spiritually most nebulous of materialistic worlds. But only with this spiritual scientific perception, and the seriousness living within it, can be understood what it means that in the last 30 to 40 years we have not wanted to turn back within the German character to the German spirituality, which is referred to here in my essay. On the contrary, we have finally come so far in this German cultural world that authority has become vested in those who considered it right to let the inaugurators of Lucifer and Ahriman be sent to Russia in a leaded coach, and indeed by a man who was in their service, and who became, through all the services he rendered by thus mediating between East and West, a man who during this time built himself a villa in Constantinople, another in Switzerland, a third in Copenhagen. It doesn't do today just to casually look around in order to be able to sleep well, in view of what is actually happening in the depths of today's world. It should be felt today how necessary it is to say, we have denied and stomped underfoot what was created in the German spiritual life at the time of Schiller and Goethe, and we have the task to start there and to continue to build. we cannot pour any better New Year's thoughts into our souls than the intention to reconnect with that. In that place, and I have already mentioned this many years ago, where now our friend Dr. Kalisko has collected my essays, there lived in the 1860s and 1870s a man called Heinrich Deinhardt, who was a Viennese pedagogue. In an age that was descending into materialism, he had the spirit to take hold of pedagogy from the standpoint of Schiller's aesthetic letters. He wrote beautiful explanatory letters about Schiller's aesthetic letters, describing how human beings should be taught to free themselves from compulsory logical necessity and the necessities only arising from instincts. These letters were published at that time. He was one of those who warned humanity, saying, "What otherwise must take place must be prevented by means of education." He had not yet been able to speak using spiritual scientific concepts, but with his words he pointed out at that time how the Luciferic Ahrimanic culture would arise if humanity did not shape the science and the art of education according to a condition of balance. This man, Heinrich Deinhardt, had the misfortune at that time in Vienna to be knocked down in the street and break his leg, something that could have been healed with a simple operation. However, according to his doctors, he was so poorly nourished that the process of healing could not be completed. So this man, who already saw quite deeply into what was going on in his time, died as a result of a small accident. Yes, that was the way people in Central Europe were treated, who wanted to find something out of spirituality. This example could be multiplied many times. Now, those who write like the Jesuit Father Zimmermann, I mentioned yesterday, will probably not die of hunger. Quote, also, for example, it is boasted in the weekly threefold social organism, number 6, that the new impulse, parenthesis, a favorite expression of the anthroposophists and the threefolders, parenthesis, is based on the fullness of Steiner's spiritual knowledge. The manager of the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory in Stuttgart has founded the Free Waldorf School for the children of the employees and workers of the enterprise, inspired by all that has come to him from the thoughts of Dr. Steiner's anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. There, anthroposophy is to be the artistic educational method. End quote. Those who mock and want to tread into the dust what wants to come forth from the spirit of the time will also not die of hunger in our present hard times. But it will be very necessary indeed that we imprint such New Year's impulses into the soul that will ensure that we do not sleepily and carelessly pass by what is really happening. Above all, we must energetically take up what is strongly emphasized by anthroposophically oriented spiritual science. Oh, I see quite a few in our own ranks who would most love to sleep through those things that reveal themselves out of great compassion, out of pity for what in our time, if it were left to itself, must lead to ruin. There are weak souls who enroll in this anthroposophical society, and who say, yes, spiritual science, that I like, but I don't want to know anything about social activity that doesn't belong in there. They could take an example from the opponents. The Jesuit Father Zimmermann follows everything that we do. He ends his article by saying, quote, the weekly threefold organism, number 8, certainly means that here there was an attempt by the Church to destroy the historical task of the self-determination of the individual. End quote. And also in other articles, the Jesuit Father Zimmermann has shown that he concerns himself with everything that goes on with us. So one would wish that those in our own ranks would also concern themselves about things in a positive sense. You see, I would like to say that the watchers who only see how they can discover any kind of weakness in the field of anthroposophically oriented spiritual science and what arises from it are not few in number. But I think you know I am not so foolish as to refer to something of the sort I am about to mention out of vanity, and therefore I can also dare to do so. Of course, the opponent's side would like to easily find a point of attack here and there. It is surely good, then, to be able to read in the essay that Dr. Rittelmeyer wrote on, quote, Steiner, War and Revolution, unquote, quote, Just in these days I spoke with a young Swedish scholar of political economy from the school of the strict national economist Cassel, who said to me that he read Steiner's book from cover to cover in the expectation of being able to unmask him as a dilettante, but he had not succeeded in finding him guilty of any errors." Unquote. Yes, more consideration should be given to such things in our circles. We should build on the basis of the knowledge that what is intended here has nothing to do with the customary idle talk of theosophy that takes place here and there, but which is based on just as strict a judgment about things as any science that has ever established its worth. If something like that were thoroughly appreciated, then one would also know why what happened is now called a defection by Father Zimmermann. You know that that was not the case, but that we were thrown out because we did not succeed in bringing a real seriousness into the society of wishy-washy talk, because there a real seriousness was not wanted, because there they wanted to continue to chatter on in the same way as they had chattered for years, at best in connection with something or other about which one can say all kinds of things without having any knowledge of the spiritual world. What our time so urgently needs is complete seriousness in the area of spiritual life. Since my being here in these days is coming to an end, I wanted to speak again about this complete seriousness on this New Year's Day, and I would very much wish that a New Year's resolution that each person can only make for themselves will be there among us, namely that through the hearts and minds of our friends, eyes are opened for the vision of what is desperately needed, opened for what can only come from the Spirit alone in order to help humanity. Today we cannot bring about healing with the existing outer arrangements. We must impress something new into the development of humanity. This must be recognized. And to feel that it must be recognized is surely the worthiest New Year's thought that can arise in your hearts today, at the beginning of the year 1920, which will bring many important decisions if people are found who recognize what humanity needs, as it was indicated today. It must be recognized that the year 1920 will bring want and misery if such people are not found, and only those have the say who want to continue working on in the same old way. The end of Lecture 5 and the end of the set of lectures entitled Cosmic New Year, Thoughts for New Year 1920, Volume 195 in the Collected Works by Rudolf Steiner.